Let's look at some details of the terrestrial carbon cycle in natural and working lands. Okay, this is going back to a schematic of the carbon cycle. We already looked at some numbers. We will look at numbers again, but let's also keep looking at the processes, the components of the carbon cycle. Obviously, sunlight is needed, carbon dioxide is needed to drive photosynthesis when there are photosynthesizers with the required chlorophyll pigments, and they, as we said, move up nutrients and water from the soil and roots into the leaves, and leaves combine carbon dioxide and water to produce carbohydrate, which is then moved down into the roots, and there are exudates that come out of the roots, and the microbes rely on that. So there is a whole biome associated with these trees and soils and so on. Okay, there is decay of organisms happening as well in the soil. Above soil, there are insects, there are pollinators, there are birds, bees, and various other animals that feed herbivores like these, for example. Okay, so that organic carbon is sequestered over longer times with as fossils and fossil fuels. That has happened over millions of years, and there is a tidbit that maybe evolution of termites around 120 million years ago reduced the formation of fossil fuels because they started respiring a lot of the hydrocarbon that should be sequestered into fossils and fossil fuels over time. Anytime you go deep enough and there is not enough oxygen and there are no aerobic or anaerobic microbes to digest or respire the organic matter, it's going to become coal or oil or natural gas and so on, depending on the conditions. Dead organisms and waste products also join the hydrocarbon pool. Animals respire, so they graze and then they respire CO2. Plants themselves respire as well, so any additional O2 oxygen that's produced is a carbon molecule fixed into carbohydrate that has to be sequestered away and not respired, right? Ocean takes up a good amount of CO2, as we will see. And roots also respire. There is fossil fuel consumption by human beings, so that is approximately our carbon cycle. We will look at a more detailed version later on. This we can never get away from. Charles David Keeling's Mauna Loa carbon CO2 curve. The terrestrial carbon cycle shows up very nicely here as well. This sawtooth pattern obviously comes from increased photosynthesis from the spring to summer months when sun comes up over the horizon in either hemisphere and you have enough sunlight to start photosynthesis. So the deciduous trees and the ones that shed leaves or just shut down photosynthesis because there's not enough light are going to start taking up carbon during the fall winter months, which increases the atmospheric carbon dioxide temporarily, and next season, spring summer, is going to be drawn down again. So that's very much the terrestrial and marine carbon cycle there, mostly terrestrial. And the smoothed version here clearly shows the anthropogenic contribution, which is increasing the CO2 in the atmosphere. Here we are heading up to 420 parts per million by volume by 2020. What else can I say? So you won't, we already said many times that there is no reduction seen in CO2 accumulation in the atmosphere so far, despite all the negotiations, renewable energies, etc. So we have a lot to do for bending the curve. We are still on business as usual, and The other thing to notice, this is a latest figure from this source here, Copernicus, which is showing the anthropogenic activities over 2009 to 2018 and how they perturbed the global carbon cycle. We are again looking at reservoirs and fluxes here. I will point out right away that if you look at the fluxes here for the ocean or for land, for example, it is shown as 90 being taken up by, let's say, photosynthesis. There is some equilibration with the dissolution of CO2 into the water as well. But the photosynthetic or biological activities are taking up 90 and they are emitting 90. So any sink that happens has to be measured very carefully. Obviously there are places where the water sinks because it gets heavier for various reasons. We won't get into that in this course, but the so-called thermohaline circulation, where heavier waters are formed at the surface and they sink, they take out CO2 with them as well as heat. So ocean takes up 90% of the additional energy being created by human activities, right? So the net sink of the land or the ocean, land for example is taking up 120 but belching it all almost back. So there is a small amount that is being sequestered by biological activity. So you can imagine the difficulty of estimating these across the globe. Okay, we'll keep looking at those. Okay, so here is the emissions from land use change. Okay, 1.5, this should be in gigaton carbon per year per meter squared, and this is the land uptake. So there are places where land is sequestering carbon, forest growth for example, and there is the fossil fuel emissions by human activities, almost 10 gigaton CO2 per year. There is total of almost 50 CO2 equivalent, gigaton carbon equivalent per year, which is combination of many other things. Okay, volcanoes adding a little amount there. So gas reserves, oil reserves, coal reserves. So you can see that there are estimated carbon emission still locked up in there. So all the mitigation is often about keeping it in the ground and not emitting in the first place, rather than worrying about emitting and then worrying about how to take it out. Okay, so vegetation, there is our terrestrial carbon pool. Soils, pretty big, 1500 to 2400 gigatons. So you can see the ranges of uncertainties here are quite large. This is 385 to 1135. This is 450 to 650, 1500 to 2400, and so on. So coasts, very vulnerable to perturbations. Surface sediments, in the water, ocean, you have organic carbon and inorganic carbon. So dissolved inorganic carbon is obviously the biggest pool you see on this map. 38,000 gigatons locked up as dissolved inorganic carbon, which we have to worry about if the ocean begins to warm. What happens to ocean's ability to take up carbon? Will it begin to saturate? Okay, ocean is buffered. We didn't get into those details, but ocean has a way of continuing to take up CO2 because it moves it into different compartments and doesn't easily get saturated. But if CO2 increases at a rapid rate, then that reaction in fact can stumble and other things happen like acidification. So what are the soil's roles? Why should we worry about saving soil? Soil properties, organic carbon, pH, bulk density, biology, cation exchange capacity for various reactions, available water capacity, soil structure, electrical conductivity, which is often a measure of salt in the water in the pores, soil porosity, aggregate stability, and so on. Soil functions are very critical for us for saving the soils, in addition to just worrying about mitigation. It's also all about food security. Soils serve our livelihoods, right? Food production, biological diversity, carbon sequestration, source of raw materials, availability of nutrients and water, support for plants and infrastructure, obviously, timber and so on, provisioning, regulating, cultural, supporting ecosystem services, eventually supporting the entire system of food, energy, water security, right? So one can hardly debate about how important soils are and how important it is to protect soil health. We will see that again and again. So it's not just mitigation, enhancing sinks of carbon, but also protecting soil itself from erosion, from degradation, from loss of carbon, and so on.